The studio smelled like rosin and old wood, and Ethan Walker stood frozen in the doorway with his daughter's small hand still curled inside his, watching a woman he had buried 17 years ago turn around at the sound of the bell above the door. The sheet music slipped from her fingers and hit the floor in a soft, papery collapse, scattering across the hardwood like something breaking apart in slow motion. For 3 full seconds, neither of them said a word. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. Lily tugged at his sleeve, asking in her small, careful voice whether this was the right room, and Ethan heard himself say yes, though the word barely made it past his throat. The woman standing behind the piano was Claire Bennett, the girl who had vanished out of his life without a note, a phone call, or a single explanation. Back when he was 22 and certain he knew what the rest of his life was going to look like. She looked older now, steadier somehow, but her eyes hadn't changed, and neither had the way she looked at him, like she was trying to memorize his face all over again. After the lesson ended that first day, after Lily had packed up her things and wandered toward the window to look at the birds outside, Claire leaned close to Ethan at the studio door, so quietly that he almost thought he'd imagined it, and said 4 words that would undo 17 years of carefully built distance. "I never forgot you." To find out how a heartbreak that old could still hold this much weight, and why she truly disappeared all those years ago, stay until the very end. If stories like this one, about people who loved each other once and never stopped, even through years of silence, mean something to you, we'd love to hear it in the comments below. So many of you watching have lived a version of this yourselves, and this community exists because of that shared understanding. There's always going to be disagreement about whether a person who vanishes without a word owes an explanation once they resurface, no matter how good their reasons turn out to be, and that tension sat quietly underneath everything that happened next. 3 years ago, none of this existed. Lily Walker had been a chatterbox of a 6-year-old, the kind of kid who narrated her own breakfast and asked her mother 40 questions before the school bus arrived. Her mother, Sarah, had been the center of that noise, the one who kept the household spinning with lists and laughter and an easy, steady warmth that made their small house in the suburbs of Portland feel like more than just 4 walls and a mortgage. Ethan had been an electrician then as he was now, working long hours climbing into crawl spaces and rewiring old houses, coming home smelling like sawdust and copper. Always a little tired, but never too tired for his girls. Then, on a wet October evening, a driver ran a red light on Burnside and changed everything in less than 4 seconds. Sarah didn't survive the crash. Lily, in the back seat, walked away with a few bruises and a silence that would take years to name. The silence was the part that scared Ethan the most. Lily still spoke, technically. She answered when spoken to. She said please and thank you. She nodded and shook her head at the appropriate moments. But the chatter was gone, replaced by a careful economy of words that made her sound, at 9 years old, like someone 20 years older who had decided talking simply cost too much. Her teachers noticed, her pediatrician noticed, a grief counselor named Dr. Alvarez, a soft-spoken woman with a gentle, unhurried manner, had been seeing Lily twice a month for the better part of a year, and it was Dr. Alvarez who first suggested, almost offhandedly, that music might reach the parts of Lily that conversation couldn't. "Music doesn't ask a child to explain herself," Dr. Alvarez had said. "It just asks her to listen and respond. For a girl who's stopped trusting words, that might be exactly what she needs." Ethan hadn't told anyone about his history with the woman who ran the recommended studio, because until he stood in that doorway, he hadn't known it was her. Bennett was common enough as a surname that it hadn't rung any bells searching for piano teachers online. The listing had simply said Claire Bennett, 20 years of teaching experience, specializing in young students recovering from trauma or developmental delays. 5 stars across almost 200 reviews. Ethan had read that description 3 times before booking the first lesson, thinking only of Lily, thinking only that this sounded like exactly what his daughter needed. He hadn't considered, not even for a moment, that the universe might be circling back around to finish a conversation it had interrupted 17 years earlier. Back then, when Ethan was 22, Claire Bennett had been the brightest, strangest, most alive person he had ever met, a music student 2 years ahead of him who used to sneak into the practice rooms after hours, because she said the piano sounded different after midnight, More honest somehow, less performed. They had dated for 11 months, the kind of relationship that felt less like dating and more like discovering a second version of yourself that only existed when she was in the room. And then, on a Tuesday in March, she simply wasn't there anymore. Her apartment was cleared out within a week. Her number was disconnected. Her family, when Ethan worked up the courage to call her mother, told him only that Claire had moved, that they couldn't say where, and that it would be better for everyone if he stopped asking. He had spent the better part of a year convinced he'd done something unforgivable, replaying every conversation for a clue, before he finally accepted there wasn't going to be an answer, and did what young men do when they can't fix a wound. He buried it under work, under time, under the eventual arrival of someone new. He met Sarah 2 years later. He built a life. He told himself, most days, that he'd stopped thinking about Claire Bennett a long time ago. What Ethan didn't know, what he wouldn't learn until months after that first frozen moment in the studio doorway, was that Claire's disappearance had nothing to do with him at all. Her father, Richard Bennett, had spent a decade running a financial firm that laundered money for a group of investors with far more dangerous interests than tax evasion, and when federal investigators finally built a case strong enough to prosecute, they needed someone on the inside who could testify to the internal records, someone who had seen the falsified statements crossing her father's desk during the summers she'd worked in his office to pay for conservatory tuition. Claire had been that someone. Cooperating meant testifying against her own father in a case that could put dangerous people behind bars, and testifying meant her name, her face, and her entire life needed to disappear before trial, not after. The U.S. Marshals gave her 48 hours. She was allowed to tell no one, not her boyfriend, not her closest friends, nothing but a single sealed letter left with her mother in case anyone ever came asking the right questions. She had wanted, more than almost anything in those 48 hours, to find a way to say goodbye to Ethan. The Marshals had been unambiguous about what that would cost. There's an old, unresolved argument that runs through situations like this one, about whether staying silent to protect someone is truly protection at all, or whether it's just another kind of abandonment wearing a nobler name. And it's an argument that doesn't have a clean answer even now. For 17 years, Claire Bennett lived under a name that wasn't hers, in 3 different cities, teaching piano because it was one of the only things about her old life she'd been allowed to keep. She built a small, careful, deliberately unremarkable existence, one designed never to draw attention, one where she couldn't own a home in her real name or reconnect with a single person from her old life, not even to check whether they were safe or happy, or thinking of her at all. The case against her father had dragged through appeals for over a decade, dangerous men with dangerous friends fighting every inch of the sentencing, and it was only 8 months ago that the Marshals Service had finally confirmed her protection could be lifted. She had come back to Portland not because she expected anything, but because it was the only city that had ever felt like home, and she told herself she would keep her head down, rebuild a quiet studio practice, and let the ghosts of her old life stay exactly where she'd left them. She had not, in any version of the plan she'd built in her head, accounted for a 9-year-old girl walking into her studio with Ethan Walker's exact eyes and Ethan Walker's exact stillness, holding her father's hand like it was the only steady thing left in the world. 8 months would pass before that particular splinter of memory finally worked its way to the surface, and Ethan wouldn't be ready for what surfaced with it. The lessons continued, week after week, because whatever had frozen in that doorway thawed just enough for both adults to behave like functioning professionals in front of a 9-year-old who needed this more than either of them needed, their own comfort. Claire was good, better than good. She never pushed Lily to talk. She simply sat beside her on the bench, demonstrated a phrase, and waited, patient as weather, until Lily's fingers found their own way to the keys. Within 6 weeks, Lily was playing simple pieces with a focus Ethan hadn't seen in her since before the accident, and within 10 weeks, she was humming again, quietly, absent-mindedly, the way she used to hum in the kitchen, while her mother cooked. Ethan noticed. Dr. Alvarez noticed, and said cautiously that whatever was happening in that studio seemed to be working faster than anything else they'd tried. The trouble started with a man named Gregory Pierce. who ran the Community Arts Foundation that partially funded the studio's low-income scholarship program, the same program that was quietly covering half of Lily's lesson fees because Ethan, working overtime just to keep up with the mortgage and the therapy bills, had needed the help and been too proud to say so out loud until Claire noticed the strain in his shoulders one afternoon and offered without making it a conversation. Pierce had known Claire's family decades ago in a professional capacity that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with the accounting side of her father's old firm, and when Claire's name resurfaced in the local arts community after 17 years of absence, it triggered something in his memory he couldn't quite place until he went looking. He found it in an old news archive, a photograph of a much younger Claire Bennett standing beside a courthouse. Blurred out, unnamed in the caption, but unmistakably her, filed under a story about a federal financial fraud case that had once briefly made regional headlines before disappearing into years of appeals. Pierce didn't know the full truth, didn't understand the protection program or the danger she'd walked away from, and didn't care to find out. What he saw was an opportunity to protect his own reputation and the foundation's donor relationships from any perceived scandal, however unfair the association. He raised it at a board meeting not as an accusation exactly, but as a concern, phrased in exactly the kind of bloodless institutional language that does the most damage while sounding the most reasonable. That the foundation needed to consider whether an instructor with, in his words, an unexplained and legally complicated past was appropriate for a program built around vulnerable children. The board meeting happened on a Thursday afternoon in late April, and Claire wasn't in the room for it, which was, in its own quiet way, the cruelest part. She found out the next morning, when the foundation's director called to inform her, with visible discomfort, that her scholarship partnership was being suspended pending further review, and that it would be best, for now, if she stepped back from teaching any students whose fees were connected to the program. Lily's lessons were connected to the program. Claire understood immediately what that meant. She could have explained everything. She could have gone to Pierce, to the board, to anyone who would listen, and laid out the truth of the witness protection program, the trial, the danger, the 48 hours she'd been given to disappear from a life she loved. But doing so meant reopening a case file that federal handlers had spent 17 years keeping sealed, meant potentially exposing details about ongoing appeals that still involved men who had not forgotten her name even if the public had, and meant risking safety that had only just, 8 months ago, been declared secure. Her handler, a quiet, careful man named Agent Doyle, who still checked in with her twice a year, had been explicit. "Talk to me before you talk to anyone else." She called him that same afternoon. He told her, gently but firmly, that going public with any part of her testimony history, even in self-defense, even to save her reputation, could restart legal and safety complications that had taken over a decade to resolve. "Stay quiet a little longer," he told her. "Let me see what I can do quietly, through the right channels." So Claire said nothing. She stood in front of the foundation director and let herself be dismissed without defending a single detail of her own life, because the alternative wasn't a choice she was allowed to make alone. Ethan found out about the suspension the way most parents find out about adult decisions that affect their kids, secondhand, from an apologetic email announcing a schedule change, and then, more painfully, from Lily herself, who came home from what she'd been told was her last lesson and didn't speak for the rest of the evening. Not one word, not even please or thank you, retreating into the exact silence they had spent 8 months trying to coax her out of. Ethan showed up at the studio the next morning furious in the particular, quiet way that men like him get furious, which is to say he didn't raise his voice. He simply stood very still and asked Claire to explain herself, and when she said only that it was complicated, that she couldn't explain right now, that she needed him to trust her without an explanation, something old and raw cracked open in his chest. 17 years ago, she disappeared without a word. Now here she was again, offering him the exact same silence, dressed up in a different sentence. He told her, in a voice flattened by exhaustion and old grief, that he'd spent almost 2 decades believing he must have done something to deserve that silence, and that he wasn't going to let his daughter learn the same lesson from the same woman. He said it wasn't fair to ask him to trust a mystery twice. Claire didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply stood there and let him walk out, because the truth, sitting behind her silence, wasn't hers to give away. Not yet, not without risking more than either of them understood. And the true cost of that restraint wouldn't be visible to anyone, including her, for months to come. There's a version of this argument that plays out in families everywhere, about whether the people who love us owe us their reasons in real time, or whether some kinds of love require trusting someone's silence even when it costs us something. And it's worth sitting with, because it doesn't resolve easily even when all the facts finally come out. If you've ever been the one left standing in a doorway wondering what you did wrong, wondering why someone you trusted couldn't just tell you the truth, we'd love to hear about it in the comments. So many of you watching have carried a version of that same question for years, and this is exactly the kind of story this community exists to talk through together. 1 month later, an ordinary Tuesday afternoon would bring a name back into Claire's life that she'd hoped never to hear again, and it would change everything neither of them had said out loud. Claire kept teaching, technically, out of a small back room in her rented house, taking on a handful of private students who'd followed her out of loyalty. Once word got around the community that something unfair had happened at the foundation, though none of them, including the parents, understood what that unfair thing actually was. Lily was not among them. Ethan had pulled her from lessons entirely, telling Dr. Alvarez only that things had gotten complicated with the teacher, and Dr. Alvarez, watching Lily slide back into 3-word answers and closed doors, had gently pushed back more than once, suggesting that whatever adult conflict was happening, it might be worth setting aside for the sake of the progress they'd already made. Ethan told her he needed time. 6 weeks passed, and Lily barely touched the keyboard he'd bought her for her birthday, the one that sat gathering dust in the corner of her room like a small monument to something unfinished. Claire, in the quiet hours after her remaining students left, found herself doing something she'd promised Agent Doyle she wouldn't do. She started reading everything she could find about Gregory Pierce, and about the Foundation's finances. Because 17 years of watching her father falsify financial statements had left her with an eye for numbers that didn't add up. And something about Pierce's sudden, aggressive concern over her past had never sat right. What she found, buried in publicly available nonprofit tax filings that most people never bother to read, was a pattern of vendor payments to a consulting firm that, on closer inspection, appeared to be owned by Pierce's brother-in-law, funneling foundation grant money into invoices for services that didn't seem to exist. It wasn't proof of anything criminal, not yet, but it was exactly the kind of irregularity that had, once, years ago, gotten her father indicted. She almost didn't do anything with it. It would have been easier, safer, more in keeping with 17 years of practiced invisibility, to simply let it go, quietly move her business elsewhere, and let the foundation sort out its own problems. But she thought about Lily's silence, about a little girl who had finally started humming again and then stopped, and she thought about Ethan standing in her doorway a year, no, 17 years, after the first time she'd let silence speak for her instead of the truth. And something in her decided she was done being the reason people she loved were left in the dark. She called the foundation's board chair directly, a soft-spoken retired judge named Eleanor Voss, who had a reputation for fairness that Pierce, in his hurry to protect himself, had apparently forgotten to account for. Claire didn't mention her own past at all. She simply laid out the financial irregularities she'd found, calmly, specifically, with page numbers and filing years, and let Voss's own instincts do the rest. Voss, unsettled, quietly opened an internal review, the kind that doesn't make headlines but does make people very nervous. And word of that review reached Pierce within days, exactly as Claire had known it would. It was around this same time that Ethan, at Dr. Alvarez's gentle but insistent urging, finally agreed to a single, supervised conversation with Claire. Not for himself, he told himself, but for Lily. They met at a coffee shop on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, and Claire, staring at the table between them for a long moment, finally said the thing she'd been forbidden from saying for 17 years. That she hadn't left him by choice, that federal agents had given her 48 hours to disappear after she agreed to testify against her own father in a financial crimes case, that she had wanted, more than she could describe, to find some way to say goodbye and had been told in no uncertain terms that doing so could get both of them killed. She told him about the sealed letter left with her mother. She told him about the 3 cities, the false names, the decade of appeals that had kept her hidden long after the original trial ended. She didn't tell him about Pierce, or about Agent Doyle's warning to stay quiet, because that part of the story wasn't finished yet, and she still wasn't sure it was safe to speak. Ethan sat very still through all of it the way he always did, and when she finished, he didn't offer forgiveness or anger, only a single question. Why now? Why tell him now, and not simply let it go the way she'd let it go for 17 years? And Claire told him honestly that she was tired of watching people she loved suffer in silence because she was afraid, that she'd watched it happen to Lily over the last 2 months and recognized, with a kind of sick certainty, that she was doing to a 9-year-old exactly what circumstances had once done to her, and to him. There's a strand of this story that echoes something a lot of families quietly argue about. The question of whether an older generation's instinct to endure hardship alone, to protect the people they love through silence rather than honesty, is actually wisdom, or whether it's a habit that's long overdue for retirement, no matter how well-intentioned it once was. 2 weeks after that conversation, Voss's internal review at the foundation reached a preliminary conclusion, and Pierce, sensing the walls closing in, did something desperate. He went to a local reporter, off the record, and tried to plant a story suggesting Claire Bennett was connected to an unresolved federal case, hoping to discredit her before the Foundation's review could clear her name and implicate him instead. He miscalculated badly. The reporter, a careful woman named Priya Shah, who had covered financial crime for over a decade, recognized the case Pierce described the moment she heard the details. Because she had covered the original trial 17 years earlier as a young journalist, and she remembered, distinctly, that the key cooperating witness had never been named publicly and had, according to court records, been placed under federal protection, specifically because of threats made against her life. Shah did not run the story Pierce wanted. She started digging into Pierce instead. 3 weeks would pass before Priya Shah's own investigation collided directly with Eleanor Voss's internal review, and when it did, neither Ethan nor Claire would be ready for how loudly the truth would finally arrive. The collision happened at a Foundation board meeting that was supposed to be routine, a quarterly review that Pierce had scheduled himself, confident he could steer the narrative before Voss's findings became public. He hadn't accounted for Priya Shah showing up at the meeting as a credentialed member of the press, having connected enough dots in her own reporting to know that whatever came out of that room mattered a great deal more than a small nonprofit's internal politics. He hadn't accounted for Agent Doyle either, who had been quietly notified through federal channels that Claire's old case was at risk of being dragged into public conversation by a private citizen with no security clearance and no idea what he was actually threatening to expose, and who arrived at the meeting in person, out of uniform, simply to make sure nothing was said in that room that shouldn't be said anywhere. Voss opened the meeting by presenting her review's findings without ceremony. 11 months of invoices from a consulting firm that provided no verifiable services, all approved personally by Pierce, all funneling exactly $42,000 over the fiscal year into an account traced back to his brother-in-law. The room went very quiet. Pierce, cornered, did what cornered men in polished suits often do. He tried to redirect, bringing up Claire's name again, suggesting the board was being distracted from a more serious concern about instructor vetting standards. It was Agent Doyle, standing quietly near the back of the room, who finally spoke, identifying himself only by his title and stating in a calm, unhurried voice that carried more weight than any raised voice could have, that Claire Bennett had served as a protected federal witness, whose testimony had helped convict several individuals on serious financial crimes charges, and that any attempt to publicly connect her name to that case without authorization would itself constitute a serious federal matter. He didn't need to say anything else. Pierce's face went the color of old paper. Meanwhile, in a separate room down the hall where Ethan had brought Lily for what was supposed to be a quiet, low-stakes recital preview, one of the small showcase events the Foundation still held for its scholarship students, arranged weeks earlier before any of this had unraveled. Lily sat at an upright piano that had seen better decades, working through a piece Claire had taught her months before Ethan had pulled her out of lessons. She'd asked quietly if she could play it one more time, and Ethan, worn down by weeks of watching her retreat back into silence, hadn't had the heart to say no. What neither of them expected was for Claire to walk into that room mid-piece, drawn by a receptionist's offhand comment that a Walker girl was playing something familiar down the hall, and to stop exactly the way Ethan had stopped in her doorway all those months earlier, watching Lily's small hands move with a precision, and feeling that no other instructor in that building could have taught her, because it required the specific patience Claire had spent months building between them, the particular way she'd shown Lily to let her left hand carry the grief of a phrase, while her right hand carried its hope, a technique she called voicing the silence, something she'd developed herself over years of teaching children who had stopped using words. Lily finished the piece and looked up, and for the first time in 2 months, she spoke more than 3 words in a row. She said, quietly, that she'd been practicing at home, even though her dad didn't know, that she'd been playing with the sound, turned all the way down so he wouldn't hear, because she didn't want him to feel bad about making her stop, but she didn't want to stop either, because when she played, she could still hear her mom humming along the way she used to in the kitchen, and she didn't want to lose that too. The room was silent except for the hum of old fluorescent lights. Ethan, standing in the doorway, felt something in his chest give way entirely. The same wall that had been holding steady since October 3 years ago, since a doctor had come into a waiting room with a face that told him everything before he said a word. Down the hall, the board meeting was concluding. Pierce would resign within the week rather than face formal removal, and Voss, in her closing remarks, made a point of stating for the record, without naming Claire directly, but without needing to, that the foundation owed a debt to the individual whose diligence had uncovered the financial irregularities in the first place, and that any suspension connected to unfounded concerns about that individual's character was being permanently rescinded, effective immediately, along with a formal written apology. Claire didn't stay to hear the applause that followed, if there was any. She was already back down the hall, standing just outside the practice room doorway, watching a father and daughter hold each other in a silence that, for the first time in a long time, didn't feel like something broken. 8 weeks would pass before the prestigious regional piano competition Lily had quietly qualified for, without either adult quite realizing how far she'd already come, would arrive and demand an answer to a question none of them had said out loud yet. Whether this reunited, still careful family had the courage to stand in front of an audience and be exactly as visible as the truth now required them to be. The Cascade Regional Young Musicians Competition filled an auditorium that seated just under 600 people, and Ethan sat in the 3rd row with his hands clenched around a program he wasn't reading, watching his daughter walk out onto a stage that seemed built for someone twice her age and half her nerves. Claire sat beside him, not as a formal instructor anymore, since the Foundation's scholarship program had reinstated her with a written apology and a standing invitation to expand her curriculum however she saw fit, but simply as the person who had spent 11 months teaching a grieving 9-year-old how to let a piano say what her voice couldn't. Lily played the same piece she'd played in that empty practice room down the hall from a board meeting that changed everything, the one where her left hand carried grief and her right hand carried hope, and when she finished, the auditorium held a beat of silence before the applause broke. The particular silence that happens when several hundred strangers realize they've just watched something more honest than a technical performance. She didn't win the top prize. She placed 3rd, which the adjudicators noted, with visible surprise, was remarkable for a student who had only truly returned to consistent practice a few months earlier after what her teacher's letter of recommendation had carefully described as a period of significant personal difficulty. Lily didn't seem to mind about the placement at all. She came off stage, found her father and Claire standing together, and did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She ran, full speed, arms out, and hugged them both at once, saying, in a voice loud enough for people nearby to hear, that she wanted to keep playing forever, that the music felt like the only place where her mom still got to talk to her. That evening, the local paper Priya Shah worked for ran a story, not about Pierce's resignation, which had already been quietly reported weeks earlier, but about Claire Bennett, finally identified by name with her own consent, describing in careful, respectful detail the choice she'd made 17 years ago to testify against her own father and disappear from her own life in order to help convict men who had, in the years since, been linked to considerably worse crimes than the ones that first put them away. Claire had almost declined the interview. Agent Doyle had finally confirmed, weeks earlier, that with the last appeal exhausted and the relevant parties now serving lengthy sentences, there was no longer any security reason for her to remain anonymous, and it was Ethan, of all people, who encouraged her to tell her story publicly, saying that a version of the truth this quiet had already cost her 17 years, and she didn't have to keep paying for it in silence anymore. The Foundation, in the aftermath of Pierce's resignation, offered Claire a formal position as director of a newly expanded scholarship music program, complete with a modest salary increase, and her name on a plaque in the studio lobby. She thanked them and declined the plaque, though she accepted the position, telling Eleanor Voss privately that she didn't want a wall commemorating her name. She wanted the scholarship fund itself renamed and expanded specifically for children recovering from trauma or loss, the exact kind of program that had brought Lily to her studio door in the first place, funded in part, quietly, by money recovered through the very legal case that had once taken her whole life away from her. Months later, on an ordinary Sunday afternoon in early autumn, Ethan stood in the kitchen of the house he'd shared with Sarah, and now, in a slow, careful, unhurried way, was beginning to share with Claire too, listening to the sound of Lily practicing in the next room, no longer with the volume turned down, no longer hiding anything from anyone. Claire came in from the studio, tired in the particular satisfied way of someone who'd spent the day doing work that mattered, and stood beside him at the sink, watching their daughter, because that was what Lily had started calling her, quietly, on her own, a few weeks earlier, without any of them making it a formal conversation. Work through a difficult passage for the third time in a row, Claire said, softly. That she used to think worth was something you had to prove, something you earned by being visible, by being the best in the room, and that it had taken losing everything to understand that real worth was the kind that stayed steady even when no one was watching, the kind Ethan had shown every single day of the last 3 years without ever once asking anyone to notice. There was no piano key, no dramatic gesture to mark that moment, only the two of them standing in a kitchen that smelled like dinner and rosin, listening to a 9-year-old find her way, note by note, back into a life that had once gone quiet and had finally, gently learned to speak again. If there is someone in your own life who went quiet after a loss, who stopped trusting their own voice the way Lily did, we hope you'll think of them today, and if it feels right, tell us about them in the comments. Even just to say their name and remind yourself, out loud, that they were worth waiting for. And if you believe that people who disappear from our lives sometimes carry reasons far heavier than we ever imagine, and that quiet, overlooked love deserves to be seen just as much as the loud kind, we'd be honored if you stayed part of this community and subscribed, because these are exactly the stories we intend to keep telling. Thank you for spending this time with Ethan, Claire, and Lily. Stay with us for the final truth still waiting at the end of every story like this one. The truth that being underestimated, or misunderstood, or even left behind for reasons no one explained at the time, is never the end of the story. Sometimes it's simply the part before the piano starts to play again.